Hello, you're listening to The Olive Tree with me, Julia Fisher. Last week we heard from a Jewish believer living in Israel who is working amongst Muslim people in the nations surrounding Israel. It's for that reason that he must remain anonymous. I met him in Jerusalem to record this interview. So listen now as he describes how he is seeing many Muslim people coming to faith in Jesus and why he believes a prophecy in Isaiah chapter 19 is so relevant to what God is doing in the Middle East today.
In our journey, somebody actually shared with us Isaiah 19, 23 to 25, which speaks of a highway, literally in Hebrew, a mesilah, which is exalted above the nations. The word mesilah is a very unusual word. It's talked about in our English Bibles as a highway, which we might get kind of confusing when we sort of think about the metaphor of roads and autobahns and things like that. But it's actually quite different. It's a road that's exalted above the nations. And in the time of Isaiah's writing, and when he's giving this message, it's all in the context of Egypt, which I find extremely relevant right now because Egypt is right now on everybody's map. And it's a very, very influential nation in the Middle East, especially for the Muslim world. In this message to Egypt, this shaking and then healing, this striking and then redeeming, Isaiah sees a highway from Egypt to Assyria, which includes Israel. And at the time of his writing, it was quite similar to what the Middle East is today. Why do I say that? All relationships in the Middle East are defined by one simple principle that people often repeat. I think Thomas Friedman in his book, From Beirut to Jerusalem, sort of coined it first, and basically it's this: the enemy of my enemy is my friend. In other words, people form alliances in the Middle East based around a common enemy. In fact, it shouldn't surprise anybody that this last week in the news, when I think one of Saudi Arabia's leaders was talking about Israel using its airspace to attack Iran. Now, who'd have thought that Saudi Arabia and Israel would be together? But why were they together? They're together around a common alliance over someone they don't like. And Isaiah speaks about this in Isaiah chapter 30, about woe to those who make alliances that are not of me. But the Isaiah 19 highway is completely different. Why? Because it's an alliance based on not what you're against or who you're against. It's based on who you're for. It's based on worshiping the sovereign Lord. And this is quite unusual because not only is it based on worship, it's based on enemies worshiping together. Because in the time of Isaiah, Assyria was the dominant kingdom, and they were bearing down on Israel, and Israel had a choice. Do we align with Egypt against our enemy, our bigger enemy, Assyria, or do we pay tribute to Assyria and we get Egypt off our back? In other words, it was the same dynamics that were going on at that time as they're going on today. Who do we align with against our enemies? And Isaiah says, no. He says, there's a highway coming. And this highway, which very much is over the top of Abraham's original road from Haran in the land of Assyria all the way to Egypt and then back to Israel, speaks of nations worshiping together and being a blessing in the midst of the earth of the nations. So we saw this and we thought, wait a minute here, there's something here that's above and beyond what we've ever even thought of and what we could even have ever imagined, that talks about Egypt, my people, nowhere else mentioned in the whole Old Testament, Assyria, this very, very brutal, oppressive kingdom, my handiwork, and Israel, my inheritance. And it rings a chord in our spirits to say, God is sovereign over the nations. He's doing something that we could not even imagine. We couldn't even think of. It's so above and beyond our greatest dreams and expectations. And yet, here it is. It's a highway.
So can you give me some stories, some examples of how you're seeing this being outworked?
Yeah. So for us personally, we started using this as our sort of chapter in a way, or our verses, to sort of be here in Israel, yet move from here out to the nations. And you can imagine when a Jewish believer in Yeshua from Israel shows up in a very remote Muslim village in the middle of Turkey, Iraq, Egypt, wherever, and speaks about his faith in Yeshua, it obviously attracts some attention. Now, we don't do these things in public. Most of the things we do are on a very small and one-to-one, house-to-house basis. But your presence and who you are, I think C.S. Lewis actually made a comment, and he said, the Jewish believer in Yeshua, and he was married to, remember, a Jewish believer in Yeshua, is the most normal person on the earth. I'm paraphrasing here, because he actually has become what the human race has been created to be. And in a way, I think it's something that has to do with just being there in your presence. I mean, it's not easy for us to go, but getting there to these places, they're just so thankful that you've come. And they will make the comment, look, you're a Jew, you believe in Yeshua, and I'm a son of Ishmael. I'm a Muslim, but I can believe in Yeshua too. And they'll say, wait a minute, you've done this, I can do it too. And it's almost like they're provoked to think, wait a minute, I can think. In other words, the Middle East is very much defined by what we call the status quo. What you're born, that's what you are. You can't be anything else. So when you meet somebody that's broken that, then you start to think, wait a minute, I can break that too. I don't have to be that. I'm not environmentally or nationalistically determined or ethnically determined or religiously determined for the rest of my life. I can step outside of this. And so in a way, Isaiah 19 and the highway steps outside of all that, because you have them together, a blessing in the end of the earth. You have people doing something that it's, maybe nobody could have thought they would have done.
So are you telling me you are seeing Muslim people becoming believers in your Messiah, in Jesus?
So in the last 20 years that we've been walking this highway, I don't think we would have believed we would begin to see. It's not through us. I believe it's through the prayers of thousands of people. I think I go back to 1994, and there was an initiative called Praying Through the Window, the 1040 window, which ignited and mobilized prayer in the Muslim world, in the Middle East, for the Jewish world as well. And I think the changes that we've seen in the last 20 years, whether they've been in Iran, Jordan, Iraq, Egypt, I think we've seen now more Muslims come to faith, and even more Jewish people come to faith, and maybe more even Christians and whoever, all these different groups. I think there's more opportunities for them to change their allegiance and follow Yeshua together with others from different backgrounds, I think, than we've seen in all of history. Not only are they coming to faith, but they're coming to faith and they're wanting relationship with those from the other side. In other words, when a Muslim comes to faith, he wants to meet those from the Jewish side, those who are sons of Isaac who come to faith, and he wants to come and see the places where he lived. And when there's Jews now coming to faith, they're now starting to realize, wait a minute here, we're not just here in the Middle East to just take this little piece of ground. We're here as well. We have a responsibility to invite Ishmael back into the house. He was rejected, and now we need to bring him back. So they're now as well Jewish believers that are learning Arabic, that are learning languages and saying, look, I want to be a part of God's answer in the Middle East, not the problem.
So you're seeing this movement increasing?
If I look back 20 years ago when we first came to this nation as immigrants, and we were definitely very unusual, now I would almost say it's common. There are other people that are dreaming this way, thinking this way, believing that God's going to use them to go there. And we're not the only expression of Isaiah 19. We're just one part of it. There are now many different expressions that this is taking. Young people coming together, people coming from many different nations to pray on the Isaiah 19 highway. Other people that are now, because of the Isaiah 19 vision, are giving into initiatives of mercy and relief. It's taking all kinds of different forms. There's now even a new initiative to bring together Israeli believers, Egyptian believers, Turkish background, Kurdish believers in a discipleship school where they're all learn together in a very secure place and community and study the Bible together. So it's taking all kinds of different forms. I don't think we could have imagined. On one side, we're seeing these, great big shakings in the nation. On the other side, we're seeing unprecedented opportunities.
So if I'm asking you, how do you think this is going to look in 2-3 years' time? What are you expecting to see?
I don't know how fast what's coming at us is coming. I don't think most of us who've lived and worked in the Middle East for the last 20, 30 or more years believed that we would see the type of things we're seeing today happen. But it's my prayer that when we look at those first words in Isaiah 19 where he says, in that day, most biblical commentators and most people thought, well, that would be in the millennial kingdom. But I think we're beginning to see a taste and something of the future happening in that day is really beginning to happen in our day. Now, it's only maybe a foretaste, but it is beginning to happen. I think the end of days is basically the future speeding up, the end of days invading the present. Where we are on that timeline, I don't know. But one thing I've known is that walking with God, it's okay to expect the unexpected, and we may be entering a time of one of those suddenlies, especially regarding the Jewish people and many of the other peoples around, the Muslim people around.
Many of the people listening to this program will never have heard anything like this before. Other Christians tend to take sides. They're very pro one people rather than another. What would you say to them? What is the key to praying God's will at this time?
One thing that I've understood in walking through a cross-cultural marriage as well as living in the Middle East for the last 30 years is that he doesn't give us grace for the offense of another. In other words, Julie, if you did something to me, God would give me grace to forgive you. But if you told a friend about this, God would not give your friend grace to forgive me because I didn't hurt your friend. And in a way, this is kind of describes a lot of times what Christians will do in the Middle East. They tend to take on the offenses of one side or the other. And it does some very dangerous things, actually, to them personally. Because as John Piper says, if we don't forgive, we don't get God. And Jesus said very clearly, if you want to walk in this kingdom, you're going to have to forgive just as my Father has forgiven you. And so that is the basis of a relationship. In other words, it's connected. And so it's really important that we guard our hearts in this time about what we see in the media. Yeshua said it like this, and this has been something that I've always held on to: judge nothing until the proper time. And that proper time is when you get all the facts. And really, you can't get all the facts from far away. You only get facts as you come and you live and you walk in this region. The other thing I believe is really important is that you base your prayers and your vision of the Middle East on God's purposes and his covenant and his promises, not on what you read in the news and not even what other Christians will tell you. In other words, God's purposes are much wider and bigger than the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, much greater. I mean, I'm not ignoring it, and there's an important part in it, but it's just a small piece of God's overall purpose and plan to bring his kingdom to all the peoples in the Middle East. And I believe that Isaiah 19 really, really expresses that, among other places. There's many, many other prophetic scriptures and prophecy. The other thing, and this is something that's hard for people sometimes to understand, and that is, I think probably over 50% of the prophetic scriptures relate to one central event. And this is important in God's history, and that is the return of the Jewish people back to their ancient homeland. Isaiah 19 couldn't happen without the Jewish people coming here. Don't know about the borders specifically, but I know it's important that they are back here because it's from here that God wants to use them in his purpose for the sons of Ishmael.
A Jewish believer in Jesus, bringing up-to-date news about what God is doing in Israel and the Middle East in these days. And you're listening to The Olive Tree with me, Julia Fisher. The Olive Tree Reconciliation Fund is a Christian charity based in the UK that supports the needs of both Jewish believers and Arab or Palestinian Christians living in Israel and the wider Middle East. If you'd like to know more about our work and receive our free bi-monthly newsletter, please either visit our website, olivetreefund.org, or write to me, Julia Fisher, at the Olive Tree Reconciliation Fund, P.O. Box 850, Horsham, RH12 9GA in the UK. Do join me at the same time next week for another story from the Olive Tree. Until then, goodbye.